There we go. All right. So good evening, everybody. Good afternoon, Professor McAdams. Um, another colloquial meeting, and actually, I just wanted to say that it is a very special one. Today, Ran Gwili returned home at last. So the last of the hostages of this horrible war um, finally came home. So that's a very emotional day, I think, for all of us. And we just wanted to make this small disclaimer for him. Um, let's just directly jump in to our lecture today. So we are very very lucky to have Professor Stephen McAdams um, for us for today. Professor McAdams studied music composition and theory at De Anza College in California before turning to perceptual psychology at McGill. He then studied psychoacoustics and auditory neuroscience at Northwestern University, continuing on to complete a PhD in hearing and speech sciences at Stanford University. In 1986, he founded the Music Perception and Cognition team at IRCAM, Centre Pompidou in Paris, and organized the first conference on music and the cognitive sciences there in 1988. He was a research scientist in the French CNRS and then returned to McGill to direct the Center for Interdisciplinary Research in Music, Media, and Technology. He held the Canada Research Chair in Music Perception and Cognition from 2004 to 2025 and was recently awarded a distinguished James McGill Professorship. He was named Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Society for Music Perception and Cognition in 2022. He is currently interested in the perception and cognition of musical timbre applied to a psychological foundation for a theory of musical orchestration. Professor McAdams, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. And go back up to the beginning. So, can you see that very well? Is everything good? Can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Yes, yes.
Okay, it's okay. Okay. Great. So I want to thank Barak for the honor of giving this lecture. My aim today is to introduce a topic that straddles music psychology and music theory, taking what might be characterized as a systematic musicology approach by attempting a transdisciplinary integration of the two domains around a subject of what orchestration offers in music listening. As a psychomusicologist, I'm obviously focusing on a listener-oriented approach to this topic. So, how might one move toward a theory of orchestration practice that is grounded in perception and cognition, given that there's no real theory of orchestration like you might have theories for rhythm and meter and harmony and counterpoint and things like that? So, first of all, we want to search for implicit perception-based theory in orchestration treatises and scores, and we've begun that. And in this case, when I say implicit, theory is implicit in the sense that certain aspects of orchestration practice are based on rules and conventions that are followed intuitively without ever being formalized explicitly. Now, our aim is to indeed formalize the principles on the basis of underlying perceptual processes, adding new knowledge by conducting experiments to determine both how listeners perceive the analyzed phenomena and what musical and acoustical parameters are responsible for these perceptions. To do this, we want to build a theory of orchestration practice based on perceptual and cognitive processes, which would include perception of timbral properties of sounds and their concurrent and sequential combinations, perceptual organization processes that are based on timbre, and the contribution of timbral properties to attention, memory, and the apprehension of larger scale forms, and finally, learning of different types of timbral relations to show how timbre might be contributing to form in this sense. But true theory is actually should be predictive, not prescriptive, and so the hope is that such a theory could indicate new avenues of exploration and orchestration practice and analysis as well. And I'll focus on two of these as a starting point today: timbral properties of sounds and their concurrent and sequential combinations, and then perceptual organization processes that are based on timbre. So analyses of scores and orchestration treatises reveal that many orchestration names are implicitly related to auditory grouping principles. Auditory scene analysis concerns the processes that help us make sense of what's happening in the acoustic environment in terms of the behavior of different sound sources. So auditory grouping processes organize the acoustic environment and determine what sound components are fused together into musical events in concurrent grouping, which events are perceptually connected over time into what we call auditory streams in sequential grouping, and how listeners chunk event streams into musical units in segmental grouping. My teacher, Al Bregman, founded the field of auditory scene analysis and proposed the notion that perceptual qualities are computed on the results of grouping processes. So what might the perceptual qualities and the corresponding orchestral effects be that result from these different types of grouping? Timbre, pitch, dynamics, duration, and spatial position emerge from the perceptual fusion of acoustical components into a single auditory event. That is, they are properties of those events. So concurrent events in music either blend together, from which point these things arise, or they are heterogeneity that keeps them separate, in which case you have multiple versions of these going on. Similarity in these parameters is involved in the integration of events into perceptually connected auditory streams, textures, or orchestral layers. And conversely, differences in them provoke the segregation of events into different streams or orchestral layers. What arises from these connections in listeners is the perception of melodic, rhythmic, and timbral patterns, which are computed within but not across streams. We also include here the formation of other sequential structures such as surface textures and orchestral layers, which I'll discuss in a bit. Discontinuities in musical parameters promote segmentation of musical units, whereas a succession of unchanging or gradually changing blended or integrated instrumental sounds creates a sense of continuity, which would be grouped over time as one unit. Here we're dealing with orchestral contrasts of varying strengths and the creation of orchestral gestures through timbral progression. We'll look at these in more detail now. Here are some of the roles of auditory grouping processes in orchestration practice and realization, but certainly not all of them. One is that we can create new timbral percepts in fused events, and this comes from blending the sounds from different sources together by doubling and coupling and things like that. Secondly, we can enhance differentiation of auditory streams. Here we're playing on the role of similarities and differences in musical parameters in the formation of musical streams and surface textures. Now we need to distinguish auditory streams from musical parts or lines, as David Huron has noted, and we'll come back to this notion in a moment. Next, we want to be able to form different orchestral strata or layers, and these are loose groupings of instruments into foreground and background layers, so we have differences in the prominence of these layers. And what is interesting in terms of orchestration is what is the role of timbral salience and bringing some sounds to the foreground and relegating other sounds to the background. And finally, we can use the continuity and change in musical parameters to create a kind of a hierarchical nesting of units in music, okay? And these different types of change have varying strengths can signal the strength of various motivic, phrasal, thematic, or sectional boundaries in the music. So when timbre and orchestration are playing a role in this, they're contributing to the actual structuring of music in this particular sense. Now, auditory grouping mechanisms such as these, they first of all give rise to perceptual properties, as I just mentioned, and they then acquire musical functions depending on how they are arranged with respect to each other in a musical discourse. And it's in these musical functions, that we hope to eventually fashion into a psychological foundation for elements of a theory of orchestration. So this diagram gives you an idea of the reason behind initially focusing on auditory grouping mechanisms as the beginning of a chain of perceptual and cognitive processes that result from orchestration decisions and which give rise to rich musical experience. I'll present the taxonomy of categories we've developed to analyze the perceptual results of orchestration, which are linked to auditory grouping principles. We call this the taxonomy of orchestral grouping effects, or the TOEG in short. And the primary aim here is to develop systematic tools for orchestration analysis that are grounded in knowledge about perception. These include, as I mentioned, concurrent grouping, so either sounds are blending together or they're not blending together. Sequential grouping, so here we're forming streams, one or more streams. We're integrating information into textures of some kind, which I call surface textures, to distinguish them from things like polyphony and heterophony and monophony and things like that. And finally, stratification, or the creation of orchestral layers, of foreground and background and middle ground layers. And then we have segmental grouping, and there's a number of categories in the taxonomy of these. Antiphonal contrasts that are underscored by instrumental changes, timbral echoes, timbral shifts, passing patterns from one timbre to another, various kinds of juxtapositions where orchestration is underlining differences in musical material over time, and then finally the contribution of orchestral factors to sectional boundaries, which all these contribute to musical form perception. So let's first look at concurrent grouping. So basically, perceptual fusion results in the formation of auditory events. Okay? And this event formation can depend on a number of different grouping principles, which have been laid out by the work of people starting with Al Bregman and spanning out from there to other people. Things that start and stop together, so which have onset or offset synchrony, tend to be grouped together. Things that have pitches that are in a harmonic relation tend to be grouped together. And finally, events that change in parallel in both amplitude and frequency tend to be grouped together. So a lot of these properties can be gleaned from the score and thus from a symbolic representation, although they still will depend on timing, tuning, and balance in performance itself. So performance will play a role in all of these things. But the fusion of these sound sources can also depend on various timbral properties resulting from their spectral relations. So frequency spectra that overlap of constituent events, okay, can also create stronger fusion, whereas if they don't overlap, they don't fuse. And overall spectral density plays a role, as we've shown in work on sound mass music. You can get things that are so dense that people can't possibly analyze them out into multiple sources. You think of some of the work of micropolyphony of George Ligeti, for example. That's a good example of that. We know from Bregman's and others' work that auditory attribute events depends on concurrent grouping. So attribute perception is computed from event properties, and therefore it's important to keep in mind that grouping precedes the extraction of these attributes. Okay. So this means that timbre depends on concurrent grouping processes. It is created by the concurrent grouping processes. So as a composer, in this case, you can, by putting various things together that make those sounds fuse together, you create new timbres. As mentioned, the primary cues for perceptual fusion of sounds from different sources are onset synchrony, harmonicity, and parallelism in pitch and dynamics. So how do composers and performers of music use these cues, either knowingly or otherwise, in the creation and production of music? So let's look at a classic example of Bolero by Maurice Ravel, where he basically at different points in the score stacks up instruments in a harmonic series. And here's one example in a certain measure where he has the French horn playing the fundamental pitch, celesta at the octave, piccolo at the fifth above that, celesta at the double octave, and piccolo the third above that. So creating the first, second, third, fourth, and fifth harmonics in this case. So in this sense, he's creating the fundamental. They're starting and stopping together. They're playing in perfect parallelism in this particular case. And so in a sense, they are creating what I would call a virtual source or a virtual voice in the music. Now, notice in this case, I think Boulez does a good job of getting things balanced and synchronized and so on, but there's still the fact that when the horn plays those repeated notes, it plays a little bit louder and it's a little bit out of sync with everybody else, and so it stands out and no longer fuses well with them. So this demonstrates how dependent the blend is on performance variables of tuning, timing, and balance. So here's the taxonomy for concurrent grouping, which leads to the formation of musical events. In concurrent grouping, we distinguish blend from non-blend. And in a lot of music, non-blend of instruments playing at the same time is the default result because they are playing independently. When instruments do blend, we have a couple of possible perceptual results that were proposed by Greg Sandell in 1991 in his doctoral dissertation at Northwestern University. Timbral augmentation, where a dominating instrument is augmented, embellished, or colored by one or more other instruments, which may not be identifiable, and timbral emergence, where the identities of the constituents are subsumed into the whole, creating a new timbre. Now, a degenerate case of emergent blend is the unison or octave doubling of the same instrument, such as first and second violin sections, or 3 unison flutes in Mahler, or 4 unison bassoons in Berlioz, which can give rise to a chorus effect. When non-blend occurs in cases where synchrony, harmonicity, and parallelism exist, but the timbral properties of the constituent instruments impede the blending, following Sandell's terminology, we call it timbral heterogeneity. So this is a case where all of the auditory scene analysis principles are in play, but the sounds still don't blend because of the timbral dissimilarities between them. Each of these events can either be sustained over time or occur briefly as a punctuation. And for sustained events, they may either be stable in terms of instrumentation, or the instrumentation may evolve over time in a continuous manner, which we term transforming. Punctuation blends, I'll show a few examples of these. Punctuation blends are very short and do not allow time to orally analyze their constituents. So here's an example. It's kind of hard. If I presented that little punch there, that orchestral punch to you in a dictation class, you'd probably have a hard time putting all the instruments down that were actually playing it. So this is a punctuated emergent blend, although some people feel it might actually be an augmented timpani stroke in this case. Here's an example of a stable augmented blend, stable in the sense of constant instrumentation. English horn timbre can be enriched by 2 solo cellis. So we have the English horn. And now with the 2 celli. And now putting them into the full context. Some of the musical examples I'll play are taken from the OrgPlay music library realized in multitrack orchestral simulator OrgSem by Denis Boulian and Félix Barry, formerly of McGill University. This is a tool that has changed the face of what is possible in perceptual research and orchestration and in orchestration pedagogy, because one has the access to the individual tracks in a complex orchestral texture, which can thus be deconstructed perceptually, as I've done here. In this excerpt, the properties of onset synchrony, harmonicity, unison, and parallel change play a role. And the fact that these instruments can change pitch more frequently and independently of the harmonic background of the other strings also helps segregate them from the background. Although it's easier to distinguish the English horn and the cello in isolation, their blend is very strong in the full context. And when we analyze these kinds of effects, when we're doing analyses, we always look at a score, but we have to listen to a particular recording of these things, and we also do so in the full musical context. In this example, the horn timbre is enriched by English horn with a bit of texture added by the detached repeated notes in the horn. But Debussy here, he adds the glockenspiel, which is notated an octave above, but actually sounds way higher than that, so it's 3 octaves above. In this case, they're perfectly synchronous, they're playing perfectly in parallel, and so on and so forth. But because of the timbral difference between the glockenspiel and the horn and English horn, you can actually hear the glockenspiel separately. So this heterogeneity is due in part to spectral non-overlap, as explored by Sven-Amin Lemke and me back in 2015, because the glockenspiel is so much higher, and in part to differences in the amplitude envelope, as noted by Damien Tardieu and me in 2012, because the much sharper attack of the glockenspiel, but also in part by its inharmonicity, keep it separated from everything else. But other factors can also play a role. So spectral relations among the to-be blended sounds play a role. Spectral density or pitch clusters, as I've mentioned before, can play a role. And all this can lead to a loss of identity of constituent sounds. And in this example, a very rich and ethereal texture is created using the whole orchestra in dense orchestrations that shape the global spectral envelope over time in this piece by Ligeti that was used in 2001: A Space Odyssey. So we've seen how principles of onset synchrony, harmonicity, parallelism, timbral similarity, and spectral density play a role in concurrent grouping, which affects the degree to which instruments blend and thus what the emergent timbral properties are. These processes are directly accessible through orchestration. With Pierre-John Farrar and colleagues in an article just published in Music and Science, we've demonstrated empirically that perception of blend in orchestral excerpts indeed depends on these factors. So let's move on now to sequential grouping. In everyday life, auditory streams represent the behavior of sound sources over time. So perceptual organization is a process that connects similar sounds over time into these auditory streams to represent that behavior of sound sources. And it depends on a number of types of continuity. Spectral continuity, which can come from pitch and timbre continuity, loudness continuity, and also spatial continuity. Sounds from a single sound source don't tend to jump around in all these different dimensions at the same time. And the other thing to point out is that sounds that differ in some or all these parameters tend to come from different sound sources. So we're bringing this baggage from things that were sort of evolved to help us organize the sound world into its sound sources. And when we carry these into the concert hall or a music listening situation, composers can start to play around with these. Paul Iverson and Caroline Mbey and I have shown that timbre-based stream segregation is directly related to timbral dissimilarity. And with Manda Fisher and colleagues, we've shown that in addition to spectral properties due to timbre and pitch differences, additional factors such as onset asynchrony between parts and the degree of part crossing also affect stream segregation in orchestral excerpts. So the point here is that you can actually find reasons why things either integrate or segregate based on the acoustic properties of the instruments. Therefore, the important point here is that differentiation of musical parameters can contribute to stream segregation, and similarity promotes stream integration. And a lot of this has been put in very clear terms in the book Voice Leading by David Huron, published in 2016. Note that in all the blend examples I presented, the sequences also form integrated streams because either the instrumentation stays constant or it evolves very slowly and smoothly. So we distinguish the vertical blending, which does depend on the maintenance of relations over time, from the horizontal process of connecting events to one another over time in stream integration. Now, the segregation of parts or voices is mostly the rule in a large majority of pop music, with the possible exception of horn sections and backup vocals in tight harmonies, as well as in polyphonic music where part independence is actually sought. So by using these kinds of parameters, timbral differentiation and things like that, you can play around with the degree to which things are segregated or integrated. And I want to point out that a lot of these things, they're not all or none things. It's not either blending or not blending. You can have degrees of blend, degrees of segregation, degrees of integration, and so on and so forth. And so one can play around at a lot of sort of ambiguous realms of these kinds of things in composition itself. This sound example by David Wessel, published back in 1979, demonstrates how timbre can be used as a sequential grouping factor. So what we're going to hear is the same melody played in two different orchestrations, if you will. The upper melody is played with a single timbre and is heard as ascending triplets. The lower melody is identical in pitch content, but the notes alternate between two different instruments. And when the notes are grouped perceptually according to timbre in the lower case, two auditory streams result, each one with a descending triplet pattern at half the tempo of the original sequence. So this will demonstrate how melody depends on grouping and tempo also depends on grouping. Therefore, the reorchestration can actually alter melody perception because melodic patterns are perceptual properties of auditory stream. And a source's acoustic properties are taken into account when forming auditory streams. So let's listen to that example. Now try to hold on to the ascending triplets. So notice in this case that when it's going slower, you might be able to hold on to the rising triplets, even though it's alternating across instruments. But once it gets going faster, it sort of obligatorily splits into two different streams, and you can either focus on the horn stream or the oboe stream in this case. Oops, let's move on. Okay, so here's the taxonomy for sequential grouping. So we have integration of either event sequences into a stream or a surface texture, which I'll define in a moment, or segregation into multiple streams and orchestral layers or strata. Note that we have the most strongly integrated sequencing to the left, and things are progressively more segregated as we move toward the right. As before, these can either be stable or transforming in terms of the temporal evolution of the constituent instruments. In this example from Vaughan Williams' Eighth Symphony, we note that the registral and rhythmic differences, particularly the fact that one stream is in 6/8 and the other in 2/4, between two groups of blended instruments, are enhanced by differences in timbral brightness. First, let's listen to the individual streams, which will be integrated. Let's listen to the homophonic blend of clarinets, first bassoon, horns, and trumpets. Oops, that's playing the whole thing. Let's play this one. Okay, and now let's listen to the other one. Okay, then there's a particular group here, which is the higher winds and the bassoon, second bassoon. Oops. Okay, so that was this one. And now let's listen to it all together and pay attention to here now how you can actually separate these two separate blended streams, if you will. Oops. I gotta click it. So we have some slightly overlapping pitch registers here, but the segregation strength is strong due to all these other factors that are involved. They're covering different registers, they have different rhythms and things like this. The point here is that the orchestrational practice, the timbres that are resulting from these, are also contributing to their segregation. And so this is a case where we have each auditory stream is a blended group of instruments, and they are roughly equal in prominence in this case. Now let's look at two other classes of sequential grouping at a higher level of the grouping hierarchy. One is what I call textural integration, and this involves two or more instruments that are with contrasting but interweaving rhythmic and melodic figures, and they tend to integrate into a single textural layer. And they're perceived as more than a single instrument but less than two or more clearly segregated streams. So in this sense, it's texture more in the sense of a surface texture. And I want to make an important note on texture in the sense of surface texture here. The term texture being used is more in its meaning of the consistency of a surface, in this case the auditory surface, if you will, rather than the traditional use of this term to denote musical textures such as monophony, homophony, polyphony, and heterophony. I'll play an example of this in a moment. The other one we're interested here, and they're going to both be in the same example, is stratification or orchestral layering. In this case, we have two or more layers of musical material, and they are different in their prominence. Okay, so they're separated, but one is more prominent than the other, or maybe there's three of them and so on. And here's where we have the notions of foreground, background, and sometimes middle ground. And we're interested in the role that various acoustic properties play in the degree to which something seems more prominent and more salient, or less prominent and less salient. Okay, so I want to emphasize here again the graded nature of grouping in general. Grouping is not completely categorical, which seems to perturb many music theorists, but that is the auditory reality, and our theories need to take that into account from a perceptual point of view. So these are both cases where there's a looser grouping of instrumental parts into integrated surface textures or layers. Now let's look at an example of this from Smetana's Die Moldau from Vlast. And there are two effects happening simultaneously in this example, stratification and textual integration. The textual integration in the middle ground occurs with two flutes and two clarinets having contrasting material and integrated into a single layer. And then we have in the foreground the strings alternating with the harp. This would be a transforming situation because the foreground itself is changing in instrumentation. And in the background you have the horns and other strings. So now let's all put that into its full context. So in this particular annotation, which comes from our program OrcView, where we do these annotations, the brightness of the colors is indicating the salience. So I have the foreground, the middle ground, and then the background here. Now an alternate annotation would include the second violins in the foreground with the first violins, and to have the horn actually move from the background to the foreground in the half measure just before the harp takes over in the foreground in the third and seventh measures. Now what drives relative prominence here and that surface texture integration is dependent on the full orchestral context. So as you might have noticed, you might be able to hear more easily the separate flutes and clarinets in the middle ground when they're isolated, but you put them back into the full context and they tend to integrate into a textural integration. So we've seen how continuity and pitch, dynamics, and timbre play a role in how sequences get perceptually integrated or segregated over time into auditory streams and surface textures and orchestral layers. Now let's look at segmental grouping. And we have a number of different categories here, which I'll go through just a couple of them. Basically, any kind of acoustic discontinuity can provoke segmentation, including timbral discontinuity. Irene de Liège in Belgium tested Lerdahl and Jackendorf's grouping preference rules and found that duration, pitch, dynamics, and timbre changes, as well as pauses, induce segmentation at a local level. And larger scale discontinuities in register, texture, and instrumentation create sectional boundaries, not to mention more classic factors like harmony, for example. So what this suggests is that timbre change contributes to boundary creation, and timbral similarity contributes to the chunking of events into coherent units. So orchestration can play a role in segmentation at various levels in this case. So here's the taxonomy for orchestral grouping. There are several subcategories of timbral contrast, such as the shifting of a musical pattern from instrument to instrument in a chain, the echoing of a pattern in one instrument by another that simulates distance, antiphonal contrasts alternating between instruments or instrumental choirs, and general local contrasts that don't conform to these three, but which underline changes in other kinds of musical material with orchestration. And then finally, larger scale sectional contrasts. Now I want to emphasize the constant play in music between continuity and different degrees of discontinuity, which strongly affect boundary strength and fragmentation, both in composition and performance interpretation. Also, the notion of sectional contrast involves a strong contribution of many different musical factors, such as harmony, phrasing, rubato and phrase final lengthening, in addition to instrumental change, and is very tightly related to formal analysis beyond the local effects of instrumentation. But the important point is that orchestration can also affect formal structures in ways that are not usually taken into account in form analysis. Let's look at examples of timbral echo, timbral juxtaposition, and sectional boundary. Rimsky-Korsakov writes of the notion of timbral echoes in his orchestration treatise. The basic idea is that the echoing instrument should somehow evoke a greater distance from the listener than the original instrument. Generally, distance is signaled by the ratio of direct to reverberant sound, by a filtering of higher frequencies that get absorbed in the air, and by obstacles along the way, and by lesser intensity. The first one can be achieved by having off-stage instruments, which many composers have used. The other two can be achieved by a change to a mellower timbre and lower dynamics. One of the pairs that Rimsky-Korsakov indicates to achieve an echo-like effect is flute echoing trumpet, and this example was used by Sibelius in his Second Symphony. So the softer, mellower sound of the flute, in this case, is echoing the brighter sound of the trumpet. A more general timbral juxtaposition can be used to set off different musical materials with distinct orchestrations in order to highlight the contrast. Here, local contrasts and instrumental groups are used to set off the alternating musical materials. The first group remains constant with strings and horns, but the second group changes over time from cello to cello plus bassoon plus timpani to cello plus contrabass, and then switches over to high woodwinds. So obviously, if you were to play all this on the piano, you would still hear segmentation, but the segmentation is increased here due to the different changes in instrumental forces and so on. So larger scale changes can be used to contrast sections, as in this Haydn piece presented in the orchestration graph format developed by Emily Dolan, now at Brown University, in her excellent book, The Orchestral Revolution. In this representation, the presence and relative dynamic of a given instrument are shown in the horizontal lines with different colors for different instrument sections. So we have strings, woodwinds, brass, and then percussion. Note the changes in instrumentation between strings plus flute, sometimes reinforced by horn, reed woodwinds, and full orchestral tutti. Notice also the progressive intensification of the orchestral texture over the course of the movement. I'll just play the part that's shown here under this graph here, but you can clearly see the segmentation that's happening at a sectional level here due to the instrumentation. So let's look at two aspects of this approach in analyzing orchestration. I want to look at timbre as a structuring force in music, and then also how these different orchestral effects that we have in the taxonomy can be embedded hierarchically in a piece of music. I've analyzed two passages from orchestral works by Stravinsky and Ravel using the TOJ. We'll look at concurrent, sequential, and segmental grouping one by one for each passage to make this concept as an analytic, make this concept concrete as an analytic tool, demonstrating how timbre and orchestration play a structuring role in music. The Stravinsky excerpt from Quatre Etudes, the fourth movement Madrid, has a lot of orchestrational richness on several fronts. Let's look first at the concurrent grouping. First, we have a very rhythmic set of measures with two successions of rhythmically synchronized punctuation blends with emergent timbres. On first listening, it might sound like a single near-tutti blend, but I hear separately the constant pitch group up here from the changing pitch group down here. Okay, the constant pitch blend is transformed with the addition of trumpet right at the end here. Let's listen to just this section right here. Okay. Then we have two measures of an augmented timbral blend, okay, shown here with the darker color is the dominant instrument and the lighter color is the embellishing instruments, which is a dominant string timbre embellished by an increasing number of woodwind parts, making this a transforming augmented timbral blend, serving as a kind of brief orchestral swell. And this repeats again a bit later. Now that part. Okay. Then we have some clear punctuated emergent timbral blends with all the instruments in the previous emergent blend, adding some reinforcement with bassoons, horns, and contrabasses. These three punctuations end with a rapid and very short figure that I hear as violins augmented by clarinets. These are also repeated at a later stage over here. Oops, sorry about that. Let's play this one here. Okay. Finally, there are punctuated blends in a rhythmic background down here with dominant contrabass augmented by celli and then eventually adding on timpani, as well as a flourishing of a sustained augmented blend with dominant flutes augmented by oboes. Ignore the clarinets for a moment. Okay, now I'll just play that again. I'll just focus on the punctuations down here and that little flourish happening up there. Okay. So these are the concurrent grouping effects that are shown up here, and you can see it's already taking on some structure there. Okay, now let's look at the sequential grouping. So I can see I'm nesting that inside of the other things going on here. At the beginning, we have sort of what I'm hearing is a segregation between the constant pitch punctuated blends and the changing pitch punctuated blends here in this particular case. And again, I want to emphasize that the grouping effects are graded, not all are one, and I think this is a kind of a very weak segregation that's going on between these two streams here. Okay, and now over here, what we've got is a weak stream segregation between clarinets 2 and 3, okay, that go forward through this particular area here. And the two clarinets are synchronous with similar pitch contours, but the interval relations between their notes keep changing, which overrides to some extent these other two patterns. And there's also a foreground, background, middle ground pattern going on here, with the clarinets in the foreground, joined by, taken over by the flute and oboe flourish here in the foreground. And at that point, the clarinet pattern moves to the middle ground because it's less prominent than these up here. And then this punctuated blend down here at the bottom continues through this whole thing as a background in that case. So you can hear how the flutes take over the foreground, therefore relegating the clarinets to the background at that particular point there. Now let's look at the segmental grouping on top of all this other stuff here. And here we have a timbral juxtaposition that reinforces a textural juxtaposition between the punctuated rhythmic chords in the first part and the orchestral swell leading to more punctuated chords in a second part. And then there's a softer, more melodic section that occurs with alternating pattern in the clarinets, punctuated by a bass line in the low strings and timpani, and finishing with this flourish in the higher register of the flutes and oboes. And then a repeat of the second part happens all over again. So we can see from this diagram how lower level effects are nested within higher level effects and contributing to a structuring of the musical discourse on the basis of orchestration. Okay, now let's look at this other passage, this time from Ravel's Alborada del Gracioso, played by the Montreal Symphony Orchestra and Charles Dutoit. And let's look again first at the concurrent grouping. So there's a timbral blend flourish of dominant flutes augmented by harp in this particular case, okay, which is occurring. And then there's, in the first case here, so let's do that one. And then you double the octaves of the flutes and the harps in the second occurrence. Okay, so hear that again. Okay, now this is an emergent blend of two sustained horns that's co-occurring with these two augmented blends, but it's in a separate layer in this case. This is followed by an augmented blend with dominating trumpets, okay, embellished by three horns in unison 16th note triplets, and then it continues into an emergent blend of horns alone, and then to a single horn in a kind of a gradual subtractive orchestral gesture. Oops. No, let's go here. Okay. And then these 16-note triplets are then picked up by an augmented blend of dominant flute with harp embellishment. Okay. Now, underlying all of this, there's a transforming emergent blend of rhythmic strings that is later intensified by the brief addition of woodwinds, all in octave doublings in the underlying rhythmic pattern. And this picks up again with just the strings to underline this other part over here, which is softer. So now let's look at the sequential grouping. Come on. Okay. Now, here we see that the transforming stream integration by brass follows an intensifying and then reductive trajectory in this particular case, moving from one trumpet to two trumpets, adding three horns, and then dropping the trumpets and muting the horns, and finally reducing that to one muted horn. The rhythmic continuity and constant pitch and timbral similarity guarantee the integration into a single stream. At the level of stratification, the rhythmic pattern is in the background, the sustaining horns in the middle ground at the beginning, and the repetitive trumpet alternating between the flute and harp flourishes, and then this other pattern over here, and then moving into the flute trumpet thing over here, is all in the foreground. Let's go back here. And finally, let's look at the segmental grouping. And we have that at a couple of different levels here. We have a local timbral juxtaposition between the rapid trumpet pattern and the flute harp flourish, with two flute harp patterns here sandwiched in between three of the trumpet things. Okay, and there's a large scale timbral juxtaposition between this section here, okay, and then this section over here, which nonetheless maintains the rhythmic continuity with the preceding brass material. Okay. Go. Oh, okay, thank you. Sometimes PowerPoint trips me up here. So let's sum up and conclude here. Basically, the role of grouping processes in orchestration serves a number of roles. You can create new timbral percepts in fused events. You can enhance the differentiation of auditory streams with it. You can form different orchestral strata. And you can use continuity and change in musical parameters to create a hierarchical nesting of motives, themes, phrases, and sections in music. So here's the full analysis taxonomy. So we have a kind of hierarchical structure in which events are formed and then get connected into streams, textures, or strata, which in turn get segmented at various hierarchical levels into musical units. However, my hunch is that these levels of grouping feed back upon one another in complex ways that will need to be explored in more depth in the future, in future research. Just to conclude, I'd like to mention a couple of the digital tools we use. One is the OrcView Orchestration Analysis program, which allows us to listen to sounds and annotate them on score with all these colored boxes that you've seen. And that information can all be directly exported to our orchestration analysis and research database, which then allows us to have a bunch of different, we have about 65 different movements that have already been analyzed in the first round of this, and we're redoing some of those with a new data model which reflects the new TOEs that I've just talked about here today. And so that'll be available very shortly as we move along. And finally, just to thank my funding sources, because we can't do this without money.
Thank you so much, Professor McAdams, for this fascinating and colorful in multiple senses a talk. Thank you so much. And now we're quickly moving into our responses session. And our first respondent will be Sarit Shlei-Zondiner. Sarit is a prominent young Israeli composer. Her chamber, orchestral, vocal, and theatrical compositions were performed in many concerts and festivals by major ensembles and orchestras. For her excellence in composition for various musical genres, she won the Israeli Prime Minister Award for Composition in 2024. Sarit is a faculty member in Haifa University. She focuses on new music and curates Kontcomp Festival, which presents music and sound from Israel and abroad. Her research deals with timbre, exploring the aesthetic and cultural dimensions it conveys in contemporary art music. Investigating timbre influences her recent creative goals. She is now working on sound exhibition dedicated to Poems of Jerusalem by Yehuda Amichai. The piece's future performance will take place in the open, conflictual space of the city. In 2020, her first opera, ASD, Autistic Spectrum Disorder, was performed in Israel Music Festival and was granted from Mifal HaPies. In 2020 to 2021, she was awarded the Sidei Fellowship for Music Creativity for her excellence in orchestral writing, exploring and fusing the worlds of melodic and textual transformations. She studied at the Jerusalem Academy of Music and Dance and the musicology department at the Hebrew University with Amnon Volman, Asaf Sheleg, and Ari Ben Shabtai. Sarit, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Barak, and thank you, Professor McAdams, for your presentation. It was illuminating and wonderful. You gave a solid background, which creates an analytical vocabulary that allow us to discuss timbre and orchestration techniques. I especially appreciate that your information is based on the listener's live experience from at the one hand and on compositional craft techniques. And it is fascinating to find out that orchestration treatises can become a base for a music analysis. It connects between composer craft and the structural and deep understanding of music. So thank you. My questions and remarks focus on three different elements. The first that I will exemplify later is timbral ambiguity. The second is timbre as a musical element which sometimes deconstruct musical grammar or musical structure. And the third is the relation between timbre and tonality. So I will start with the first, timbral ambiguity. Some musical situations, which I believe are unique for timbre and orchestration techniques, are located in between the taxonomic definitions that you mentioned, and I will explain and demonstrate them. But first, I will state that what I believe that timbre can create in music and in orchestration technique also, timbre has a unique ability to create a blurry, obscure musical expression, which creates intentionally, in careful nuances, an ambivalent musical phenomena, that its background, foreground, a prominent material versus delicate materials mingles together and creates a foggy musical result. And I will now demonstrate it with a few musical examples. I will share screen. Just a second. Okay. We start with the first example. Okay. Okay, this is the second movement from Berlioz' Symphonie Fantastique. Just listen to the beginning of the movement.
We can't hear.
Oh,
Now we can. Now we can.
okay. So I'll just talk about this place. I thought about the example that you gave for from Smetana, which has some similarities, but I will talk about the difference because we see the strings here with playing a very fast tremolo and a very fast and but also in pianissimo, so it is very delicate texture. And then the harp, it's like a little bit. So I say a little bit because it's not so prominent. It goes out for a little bit, but the similarities of the sound on the strings, on the tremolo of the strings, and the arpeggio in the harp, it's not very clear that those are two different layers. They are very much combined in each other. And the example that you gave from Smetana, so when the harp did this arpeggio gesture, so it was on a very delicate texture of flute and clarinet, so it was more different, so it was more prominent. Okay, so this is the first ambiguous example, and the second one I want to demonstrate is, you see Daphne and Chloé from Ravel. Okay, so it just just also play the beginning.
No sound.
No sound. Oh,
Maybe start it over.
okay. Just a minute. Try to. Okay. Just a minute, or maybe I'll reshare the screen. I don't know why it doesn't work. Okay, it's in sound. Can you listen now? Okay, I will stop here. And there are also several layers here, but they're all like background layers with a lot of movement, with a lot of inner movement, and also create a lot of intricate relations and even gestures that could be a melodic gestures or foreground gestures are orchestrated so delicately, like those flageolets over here, or the violins, or the very low bass line. So what you get is like massive sound, very delicate and ambivalent mass of sound. So this is also an example. And the third example, maybe the most traditional one. Actually, this example is taken from Emily Dolan book that you mentioned. She called this example the chaos, the moment before the orchestral order was born. So sorry, it will take a few more seconds. Yeah, I'll also stop here. I'll just say that actually what comes out with a sporadic solo instrument is something like inner voices. It doesn't have a motivic quality or a thematic quality. There are change a lot of times. And so Emily Dolan says that this is before the orchestral order and the order of the world, before there was light. So this is a representation of the chaos. Okay, in her word, with and the timbre and the timbre plays a very significant role in here. So those are the example for what I call timbral ambiguity. And the second thing I want to talk about is what you call a segmental grouping. And the example that you gave, you showed how a timbre helps to articulate sentences, phrases, form through echo effect, antiphonal effect, etc. And what I want to show here is actually very a famous example that what happens here is that timbre is not serving those musical parameter. it works in a very different way. It creates a new grammatical interpretation of the music, and maybe some of you guessed what I want to demonstrate here. And what I want to show is this very famous example from Bach and Webern, and to show how this segmental example works very differently in here. It builds complete new music, complete new phrases. Okay, so I just hear a few seconds of it. You hear?
Nope.
Okay, so this sense that timbre works separately and create a whole new dimension of experiencing the music. And the third thing that I want to remark is actually it's like a question. That many examples that were presented in the article are from the core of Western tonal music, not all of them, of course. But what I notice also from your article, but also from my work, is that when timbre and tonality works together, I mean, when the tonality is very clear and it is strongly based, so timbre often tend to support the tonal organization. But when the tonality is getting weaker and when the tonality becomes more obscure and more and not very clear, so timbre also tend to be this way. And even more than that, because the tonality becomes so obscure, so timbre becomes the main organizing parameter of the piece. So it's I'm not positive that it always like this, but I'm just guessing and question what you think about it. And that's it for now. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much for these interesting observations. I think the first point about timbre ambiguity, and maybe even the second one on segmentation, they point out a number of things about the fact that all of these grouping effects, I want to keep emphasizing that, they're not all or none. It's not grouped or not grouped. There's a whole range of things. You can have very, very weak blends. You can have very strong blends. You can have very weak segregations. You can have very strong segregations. You can have weak segmentation. You can have strong segmentation. And when they are happening against each other on different levels, okay, in different voices, for example, things like that, you get a lot of ambiguity, like you're saying. And then you can use the strength of these things to actually create these kinds of things. And if we've been trying to analyze Wagner, for example, in terms of this, and it gets even worse when you get into contemporary music. We've done a piece by Roger Reynolds called The Angel of Death, looking at some of these things. And you basically get foregrounds that are fluctuating like even on half measures. Schubert even is doing that sometimes, where you've got these things, it's what's actually in the foreground, and it's so dependent on the way it actually gets performed. And I think this is, so I agree with you saying that there's a lot of degree of ambiguity that can actually happen depending on the strength with which any of these effects are actually taking place. And so we have to judge also in a particular performance what is the strength of the effect that's being done. There's examples, for example, in Schubert's Eighth Symphony, for example, where you listen to different recordings of it, and sometimes you get this oboe clarinet blend, and it sounds really like a new timbre altogether. Other recordings, it's a timbre that's augmented. The oboe is augmenting the clarinet. Another one, the clarinet's augmenting the oboe. And a lot of this has to do with the balances that are being actually used in performances and things like that. Timing, tuning, all those things can play a very strong role in the degree to which things blend or not in that kind of a set. But I like the idea that these kinds of effects and the timbral aspects of this can actually be used to create clarity or obscurity depending on what you're actually going for as a composer or as a performer, conductor, and so on and so forth. So I really like that idea. In the case of the Richard Carr, which is what's one of my favorite pieces, I don't remember who was talking about how basically Webern was reanalyzing the phrasing structure of this piece. Was it Karl Dauhaus? I can't remember. Somebody wrote about this a long time ago. But anyway, what strikes me there is you've got two different things working on perception of phrasing. One is the timbral phrasing, and one is the sort of classic tonal phrasing and things like that. And these are actually a little bit in conflict with each other. And this reminds me of something that John Rea, sort of a retired professor of composition here at McGill, he talks about the whole point that basically there's musical form, according to all the parameters we usually talk about, pitch, rhythm, meter, harmony, things like that. And there's orchestral form. And in many cases, these two kinds of form can work together, but they can also work against each other, which creates sense of formal ambiguity. And he says sometimes this is a really interesting thing to do in music because you're sort of keeping the listener on their toes. Was it this or was it that? This is saying that, this is saying that. And there's this kind of thing that goes on, which is what's one of the wonderful things about music. It allows for multiple interpretations for even a frozen recording. If you listen to it multiple times, you might hear it once this way and once that way. And these kinds of ambiguities are, for me, part of the essence of music. I mean, music that is too clear is a little bit boring sometimes, but where there's all these sort of structural ambiguities that are being created through these different parameters, because there's a lot of parameters we can work with, I think that's very, very wonderful. On timbre and tonality, I don't know as much about that, but again, I think it comes back to this notion of orchestral form versus musical form in a sense, because you can use orchestration. I think Kit Soden, a student of mine who was co-supervised by John Rea, was looking at cases, I think it was in Borodin and another one, where he was actually finding that there were these kinds of differences in the formal structure of orchestration versus things like pitch and rhythm and phrasing and harmony and things like that. And it's these kinds of ambiguities that create musical interest in a certain sense. But thank you for pointing those things out. I think these are all very, very relevant points.
Hey, great. So let's move on to our second responder. Asaf Brown is a PhD candidate in musicology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, supervised by Professor Yoel Greenberg. His doctoral dissertation, Beyond Taxonomies, a corpus-driven study of formal units in tonal music, brings together music analysis with corpus-based and computational methods. He holds a BA in composition, musicology, and cognitive sciences, and an MA in cognitive science, music cognition. He has worked as an algorithm developer and has lectured in programming and mathematics in colleges and professional training programs. His music has been broadcasted on radio and performed by the Ra'anana Symphonette. Asaf, take it away.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Professor McAdams, and Sarit too, for the comments. Very interesting. And the discussion. The main point that I actually wanted to raise is regarding something that you said at the beginning, that and it's actually really in the title of the model of the TOJ, that it is a taxonomy and it is basically descriptive in this, like at least what we saw today. And I was wondering what are the kind of predictive aspects of this theory, where they can be taken to. So predictive, like the predictive aspects can be divided into two main categories. The first one is I can call it like the cognitive aspect, which I saw your more recent article that really deals with it. I forgot the name now, but article from this year, 2025, that looks really interesting about like how musical experts um, perceive different orchestrations, and it's like a very interesting direction. And the other direction, I think, can be like how this model can really account for different norms and different processes and changes over time in music practice. Um, so this is what I wanted to like to comment on really briefly. So um, yeah, so like when you think about musical norms, so we basically know that orchestration practice is changing over time. Different composers have a different style of orchestration and um, and different and like it, yeah, so it can change over time. Different orchestrations are avoided, like specific orchestrations are avoided, specific others are more preferred and favored. So um, and of course, like many theoreticians and orchestrators along history discussed it in length. But the question is, can this model of TOJ really account for that? Really give us more categories, uh, like to deal with it, to theorize it, and to deal with it. So when I was trying to think about something like that, um, you have this, it's not like a real category, but more of a subcategory that repeats of transforming things, right? So in each category, you have the transforming aspect, sustain and transforming aspect of it. So for me, like intuitively, it was a quite a trivial place to go to where I think about different orchestrations, right? Because in the late 18th century, you have like Haydn and Mozart. So in the Haydn graph, it was quite permanent that you could see like quite stable blocks and and like quite separated and clean, clear blocks. And like as opposed to if one thinks about like more Brahms, Mahler, Wagner, that are more gradual growing of the orchestra in many occasions and so on. So this is not a real. So I'm just wondering because it's like not a real category in the Toj. It's like not like a separate category, but you can find it in several places, and also like other aspects of gray area, right? So you have these augmentation, timbral augmentation and timbral. Uh, what was the other one? Like the augmentation and um, okay, never mind. But
Emergence.
yeah, emergence. Thank you. So yeah, so these two effects also. I assume that more you can find them more in like late 19th century music and even more in late 19th century music. Also because they have um, like they are coming from a more gray area places, and it's more like very um, related to many well-known romantic concepts of loosened boundaries, gray areas, and etc. So I was just wondering if this is something that you or someone else is planning to do. I then saw this data annotation project, the ORCARD that you showed at the end. So it looks like it really fits into this kind of research. And um, yeah, so that was kind of the main point. And Just looking if I had something more. Yeah, we don't have many time, so I think I will leave it just like this
Okay,
and
thank you
let
very
you
much.
respond. Yeah.
This is very interesting. Yeah, in terms of the predictive aspect, I think there's a one approach we've taken is to see how much of these effects. So we have the Orchard database, which has people annotating based on listening. But we can take all that information of the scores out and then trying to do predictive analysis based on score information. And I had a couple of postdocs that have worked on that. One was Aurélien Antoine, who tried doing a first attempt at that, and then working with a PhD student, Francesco Maccarini, who was studying with Mathieu Giraud in Lille, trying to do that. And they were trying to basically predict blends based on score information. So looking at which instruments are starting and stopping together, having sort of harmonic relations, changing in parallel, and so on and so forth. And they found that they could get up to a certain level of prediction of what the actual perceptual judgments were, but couldn't go beyond that because, as I mentioned in the first part here, there are properties of the instruments themselves that have to be taken into account. And those aren't available there.
Mhm.
So then what Francesco Maccarini was trying to do was say, okay, now let's do analyses of instrument sound databases and get some basic properties of those and see if we can inject that into there. And he got a little bit better, but again, it depends on the actual performance. And so
Mhm.
you would have to do this for each individual performance and have separate tracks of all those to actually get predictive in that point. So I think that's where I think the limitation of trying to do this analysis would be, unless you could have several different orchestras and have individual tracks for each of the instruments that would allow you to look at some of these things, that would make those kinds of things fairly difficult. But we got fairly good with some of the basic things like the ASA principles, the auditory scene analysis principles, onset synchrony, parallelism, and harmonicity, and things like that. You could get a certain distance, but then you still need the information about the instrument qualities because those play a strong role. Are the spectra overlapping or not? So in the Debussy example with the Glockenspiel, very,
Mhm.
very high, of course, it's not blending. It adds something to the sound. It gives a kind of sizzle there, and he was, I think, getting something very clear with that, but it's not a blend in that sense. Okay, it's something else is going on there. I didn't quite understand the processes of change over musical. I think you're talking here about evolution of orchestrational style. Is that basically the idea? And I think
Yes.
this is we have a long-term aim for this. I think we need more pieces in the database before we can start doing that because it's not full enough to actually judge that. But that was one of the initial aims of this was how can you sort of measure what kinds of changes actually take place over time in general in orchestral music, but also look at differences between different cultures. So are Russians orchestrating the same way as Italians, as French, as Germans, as Americans, as Israelis? Who knows? These are kinds of things that you might find local differences because people talk to an office time, oh, that's a German sound, or that's a French sound, or that's an Italian sound, or that's a Russian sound, things like this. And I think there are sort of local sort of conventions, unspoken conventions or cultures around orchestration that do grow up inside of these things. And how those change over time would be very interesting. But it's the kind of thing that we can look at. And as you mentioned, clearly you see the whole realm of sort of transformational kinds of orchestrations increasing into the romantic era, which starts making annotations like the ones we're doing extremely difficult because you're having to make so many little boxes that change color every measure and so on and so forth. But these things, I think, that's a very interesting thing to look at. In terms of the sustaining, transforming, for me, that's not a category in and of itself. For grouping, it's a property of a kind of grouping. So that's why we put it as a subcategory of that, because for this particular kind of blend, for example, is the instrumentation staying constant or is it changing in a very smooth way? So, for example, you listen to Farben by Schoenberg, for example. He's got some very smooth orchestrations going on there. Whereas you have timbral change that's happening in melodies in Webern, it's much more fragmented. Okay, he's using large jumps in pitch and large jumps in timbre, and so you don't get that kind of integration and things like that. I think we can get at some of those kinds of things through the transforming sustained kind of situation. but I see it as a property of a particular effect rather than something that's a category in and of itself. And that's why it exists on everything, because what it means to be sustained or transforming for a blend is not the same as what it means to be sustained or transforming for a stratification, for example. They're different kinds of beasts. Where they're similar is, are the instruments staying the same or are they changing? But what the effect they're creating is completely different in those cases, and that depends on the effect itself, which is why I consider it more of a property there. But maybe you disagree. I don't know. It's a possibility.
Yeah, no. So actually, from a cognitive point of view, it's of course much more reasonable what you are saying and what you did in Toj. But like from I don't know, like historic evolutionary point of view. So if this is a property that you find as something that changes over time, so maybe it's like from this point of view, it's more reasonable to to put it like higher in the hierarchy. So
Okay. Or you
yeah,
can just stay at the low level and just say this is a level that changes over history as well.
yeah.
So, but that's a very interesting thing to look at, because I think it's something that's already come out, and we see that when as we move. We started from the sort of early classical era, and we moved towards romantic and late romantic, and then starting to get a little more into the 20th century now. And we see that immediately happening. This is one of the main things that happens. You get more kinds of complex stratification. Textural integration wasn't happening that much back in the high classical period. You start to get that more when you're getting into, in some operas you can get it though, but you get more of that once you start getting into early romantic and so on and so forth. But those are excellent questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great, fascinating. So now we have a few more minutes for a general discussion. Does anybody else has a comment, a question, a criticism, or something to say?
I'm all
Uh,
ears.
Maybe I'll start. Iqbal, you wanted to
No,
say
go
something?
ahead, go ahead.
Um, just a thought concerning, well, touching a little bit about on the points, actually both that Asaf made and that Sarit made regarding regarding a historical development of this notion of timbre. I find it very interesting that um, I guess before a pre-20th century timbre is obviously not the main thing, right? It's more of a side effect. It's very interesting, and I think your work has been great in defining this side effect. But even more interestingly, when timbre becomes more of the center, right? Sarit touched upon it when pitch material becomes less interesting. For example, in the trend of sonorism, of Polish sonorism in the 60s, in the 20th century. Um, so there, timbre and texture in general becomes actually part of the musical meaning, of the musical narrative. And I'm wondering, you said you mentioned that you haven't worked a lot about 20th century music, but um, from what you know, when this sort of conceptual shift happens, when pitch is set aside, becomes a side effect, and timbre becomes the main role. Um, do you find that different things happen, more intense things happen? And if you didn't work on it, what's your speculation or intuition about that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've recognized is that probably as we begin looking just at Reynolds, for example, Roger Reynolds, the one clearly 20th century piece we looked at that is of a contemporary nature. I mean, we looked at some band music by Tekeli, but it's pretty standard, so that's not really coming up with new problems. But you might start to have to add other categories into these things, and so we think that this taxonomy will have to evolve as we come into new kinds of things. And one thing that comes out in Reynolds very clearly, but then once you notice that, you start finding it even in Beethoven, is something we call timbral resonance, where you have some sounds attacking together, and then one goes away and the others continue through like that. And so you get a different color that then transforms into whatever's left going on, and we call that a timbral resonance. So it was a kind of a transforming blend, but it was almost a category in itself because it's something he uses and is trying to create, or has things that come on together and then they swell differently and things like that. So these are kinds of things that we have to figure out, how do we integrate that into a logical category structure. And then once you start getting into more saturational music or noise-based music and things like that, I mean, I'm thinking of this Professor Bad Trip by Romitelli, or who's it? Romitelli, I think it was the guy name. It's like this. It's saturational, and so basically everything's a textual integration of some kind, because it's really hard to hear out different kinds of things that are going on. So there the idea is, okay, now, okay, given that that's the case, okay, so we've got one big box that's a big saturation. Now what do you do with it? And I think, as I showed in my first diagram, the next step beyond these is, okay, once we know what the type of effect is in terms of organization, the next question to ask is, what are the properties that emerge from that? And because that's the thing now that the composer's going for. Okay, they're using these groupings as a way to get to something that has a property that they're trying to put together and put that in a musical discourse. And so the next phase of this whole project will be to actually start looking at those kinds of things, because I think that's where we can add something more to analysis, particularly of 20th century music and 21st century music, where timbre, I mean, already in Wagner this is happening a lot, and it's really trying to actually note all the times that some instruments now standing out, not standing out, and so on. It gets very complicated in this, so we need techniques for getting at these kinds of things as well. But I agree, once you get into noise-based music, for example, it's a completely different picture altogether, because now we're not talking about harmonicity anymore. We're talking about textures and densities and things like that. And so those are the properties that come to the fore that we need to somehow categorize and characterize to see how are they then creating musical discourse. I don't know if that answers your question, but
Definitely does. Anyone else? Inbal, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Professor McAdams, for your lecture. It was really, really interesting. I'm coming from the field of ethnomusicology, so but I'm always looking for more vocabulary to talk about, to define timbre and to include that into our analysis. So I'm really grateful for the vocabulary that you presented here. And so maybe I'm asking something that is out of the specific scope, but I'm also very interested in the way that we can talk about the differences in voice timbre and the connection between voice and instruments. And I was wondering, I think that many times when I think about voice timbre, either in general or specifically when thinking about more popular music, I want to say that, or in a way that vocal timbre used is supposed to have individual aspects and not something that you can compare. When we talk about the timbre of a trumpet, when we talk about the timbre of the clarinet, we have some range that we imagine, that we talk about. So I'm wondering about the vocabulary that you might think of when you think about maybe even the intersection of voice and instruments, or voice by itself, and to the comparison of this idea of, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong to assume that there is a sort of a range when we think about contemporary art music, that we have expectations of also the voice and instruments, and how do you think about that in comparison to maybe a more individual or specific aspects of voice or instruments timbre? I hope I made myself clear.
yeah, that's very clear. Voices have always scared me.
I
It's
understand.
the most timbrally variable instrument that there is of all time. I mean, when I give I have to do a graduate seminar on timbre as a form-bearing element in music, and I always start off by playing a bunch of different sound examples. And at the end, I basically go through, and it's all voices. And I'm comparing, first of all, different voices across different styles of music and different cultures. Because a Burundian voice doesn't sound the same as an Estonian voice, doesn't sound the same as a Western opera singer. It doesn't sound the same as a folk singer from Newfoundland, for example, and even a given voice. And I take a good example from the Bulgarian women's choir, for example, singing two different songs. In one, it's a very strident sound, and the other, it's a very soft sound. Same thing, even just King Crimson, two different songs by King Crimson, so it's a band from the 1970s. They can change completely. 20th Century Schizoid Man is very different from another song that's very, very soft voice and things like that. So the fascinating thing for me about voices is they carry identity, they carry culture, they carry style, they carry emotion, and all of these things have to be taken into account. And indeed, in our actor project, which is analysis, creation, and teaching of orchestration, which finished this year, but we're hopefully going to have a new one called TONE, which is Timbre and Orchestration Network. There's a working group in that that's focusing on voice and looking at all kinds of things, so cultural aspects, but also identity aspects, aspects of gender and things like that. These are all very, voice plays a role in all these kinds of things, and people's own sense of identity. Oftentimes, if they sort of change an identity, we're seeing a lot of that right now, people who want to change their sex or their gender or something like that, they change their voice at the same time. So there's these aspects of this. And also just in opera, when J. Marshall Knight here in Montreal over at Concordia University is very interested in how people who select other people for opera roles are focusing on a certain color of voice that they want for a particular type, the Fach, for example, that they really want a certain kind of thing. And sometimes that gets bound up with also what's their body shape and things like that. So all these kinds of things go together. But oftentimes it's the color of the voice they feel has to fit within a certain category for opera to actually fit with a particular role and things like that. So these are all kinds of questions where voice timbre, I think, plays a very strong role. And there's just really, it's just starting now, I think, to really be work that's looking at that. And some of the work of Nina Eidsheim, for example, around the race of voice, I think is very, very exciting from this standpoint.
Thank you.
I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yes,
it's an open area, let's put it that way.
No, I know. I'm interested now in the group, the research group that you mentioned, but I will try to look that up. Thank you.
Sure.
Anyone else?
I just wanted to ask you whether have you ever considered to use the organ music, the object, which is measurable?
Yes, I mean I think that's in fact one of the things we were talking about recently in our new project was why haven't we been dealing with organ? Because you're actually doing that. You're adding in all these different stops, so you're creating changes in the timbre. And then a big question: how do organ registrators pick which ones they want for a particular musical structure? I think this is an excellent question because you get blends of all kinds and you get new emergent properties depending on which stops you've pulled out and things like that. But we haven't done that yet, but I think it's definitely on the agenda. So, are you an organist?
Partly.
Okay.
I am.
Great. So I think it is getting quite late here in Israel. Not quite not in Montreal yet, but you'll get there. So I want to thank everybody who came here. I want to thank Asaf and I want to thank
Thank you all,
Sagit
yes.
and of course
Interesting.
Professor McAdams for a
Thank you so
brilliant
much, Professor
brilliant
McAdams.
lecture. It was fascinating. It was colorful and it was really thought-provoking. And I want to wish everybody good night or good afternoon. And thank you, everybody. And we'll see you next time in the next colloquium.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you very much.
Take care.